Welcome to this session on how to write your qualitative section in your grant application. So we'll briefly cover what qualitative research is, give some examples of qualitative questions, also some examples of when to use qualitative research, but also we will cover some common criticisms that we often see from panel's feedback. So this session is not intended to be teaching you how to learn to do qualitative research. It's more about the important things that you need to consider and include in your application. So make sure you have the right things in there to ensure that the reviewers understand your proposed qualitative methods. So hopefully at the end of this session, you will go away with some useful tips on what to cover in those qualitative sections. Not all in the research plan, but in the other parts of the application, as we will see, to ensure you will satisfy the reviewers' expectations. So what is a qualitative research? It's a broad term which encompasses a range of approaches and methods. It's originated from different disciplines, sociology, anthropology, but has been widely used in health and social care research. And the qualitative research methods can help us answer questions that aim to understand our experiences and meanings that people that we attach to our experiences and how we make sense of our experiences in the social world. So it's particularly useful when we want to understand patterns of health behavior, when we want to describe lived experiences, when we want to develop theories or interventions, when we want to explore healthcare needs, but also when we want to inform study design. And you might be asking, why do we use qualitative approaches? Because as you probably know, and as you can read in this cartoon, not every question can be answered using numbers. Not every question can be answered using quantitative approaches. So the decision of whether you should use quantitative or qualitative methods, or perhaps combination of both, is always based on your individual research question. So in general, the quantitative methods are about the how many, how much, how often, this type of questions, whereas the qualitative are more interesting in the what, how, why type of questions. They have different purposes. So the quantitative, they're interested in prediction, explanation, and they want to generalize the findings, although the qualitative is more, is trying more to provide context and a deeper understanding of a phenomenon, of a behavior. And although the qualitative develops a theory, the quantitative tests the theories and hypotheses. The quantitative is using numbers, of course, and qualitative is mostly words, observations, or objects or pictures. So here are some examples of qualitative type of questions. And as we said, they're dealing with the what, how, and why. So you may want to consider doing a qualitative study when your research aim, your research question is about patient voice and experience. And here's an example: why do young people not adhere to the asthma medication? Or perhaps you want to consider doing a qualitative study if you're interested in understanding complex organization, events, and processes. How do doctors communicate prognosis to people at the end of life? Or perhaps you want to explore a new or a sensitive topic, then qualitative is the appropriate method to use. So if your question is how do couples come to terms with stillbirth? Or perhaps when you're interested in understanding potential barriers or facilitators in participation in a study, with a view to optimizing study procedures, recruitment, and implementation. For example, what factors affect survey users' decision to participate in a trial? Or you might be interested in developing and evaluating complex interventions, and examples of questions will be: how do care home staff engage with a new intervention? What do they think of their components? And here is a table that shows different methods on your right that can be used to answer different qualitative research questions. So depending on your research question, you might want to include one or more qualitative methods. For example, some studies, they might give the option to participants to participate in both interviews or focus groups. And here are just some suggestions of the methods that can be used to answer your particular research question. So how we can use qualitative research? There are 4 possible ways. For example, if your research question requires an in-depth exploration of a phenomenon, or perhaps is in an unexplored area of research, or is primarily related to lived experience, then a standalone qualitative project might be indicated. However, very often we see in NIHR grants that in order to answer research question, a mixed methods approach is more appropriate. That includes both qualitative and quantitative. And in those examples, when you're using a mixed methods, it can be a concurrent or a sequential research type of design. For example, you might want to collect your qualitative data first, and then move on to collect your quantitative, or you want to start with your quantitative study, collect the data, and then collect some qualitative in order to expand and clarify the issues from the quantitative data you've collected. Or the fourth option is to collect both qualitative and quantitative data in parallel. In a way, you're triangulating your methods, and it's very common in large scale projects. So moving on to kind of look at a qualitative research question and how we can formulate it. Well, really, it's very similar to any type of research questions you've been hearing today and yesterday. I guess the most important thing here for me to highlight is that you need to kind of start thinking qualitative terms and use them. So for example, here in red, what is the appropriate qualitative question word to use, and then views and experiences, again, you're using qualitative wording. For those of you who have an interest in seeing more examples of qualitative studies, here is a link to a video that you could watch in your own time if you wish. It's not long, it's a couple of minutes, but gives an example of how this research team in Bristol used qualitative methods to explore communicating blood test results. And I think Brian might put the link in the chat as well. So moving on, so this part of my presentation is to talk about common pitfalls, some red flags, if you like, and criticism, and things that you want to avoid so your qualitative study can successfully satisfy the funding panel. So as you probably know, funding panels will have qualitative experts sitting on them, and their role is to check the quality of the qualitative study you're proposing and make sure it's a high quality. So you need to ensure that either your qualitative co-applicant or if you're doing a fellowship, your qualitative supervisor have valuable input in your grant application as you develop it. And of course, you can also come to RSS. We can also help with that. But as you can see in the text here, which is taken from the chair's report back in 2020, funders often report that the qualitative study components are poorly developed, not well justified and described, not to the same high standard as those of quantitative studies, and sometimes are given less word count in comparison to other study components. So here is a list, if you like, of common issues identified by the funders. And as you can see on the left-hand side, the main issues to consider and ensure you address adequately in your grant application relate to almost all sections, not just the research plan. For example, starting from the rationale, sometimes the rationale is purely justified why a qualitative study is needed, and perhaps the methods, data collection and data analysis, they're not aligned with the research question, or they lack detail in order to help the reviewers understand what data is being collected, when and how you will use the data. Also issues not showing understanding of qualitative approaches, for example, talking about generalizability or surveys. So not being coherent and consistent in using qualitative approaches, but also issues related to, for example, unrealistic timelines or not addressing ethical and rigor in your study design, or perhaps lack of expertise in the team. Another thing also is another issue is about the impact and cost. Sometimes they're overestimated or underestimated, and overcosted or undercosted. And I think I've said, talked about all of them. The last one here is BPIE, which is another thing we see often when people mix up or confuse patient and public involvement work with qualitative research. And I know you're gonna have a whole session on PPIE tomorrow, but I just wanted to highlight it here very quickly that there are differences between involving patients and service users in qualitative studies and PPIE. And obviously, in the first is the study participation, which is a kind of more strict way of participating. So people will be asked, for example, to take part in interviews, kind of more predetermined way. Most likely you're going to need ethical and other approvals, and you're extracting data from them in order to analyze them. Whereas the PPI involvement is more flexible approach for people to engage with your study, could be co-produced, involves decision sharing, and they can be involved earlier on in the development, but also during the project. And I'm sure you're going to hear more about examples and ways to be engaging in qualitative and other type of studies tomorrow. So moving on now to look in more detail what to consider when you're writing those technical sections for a qualitative study. And we're going to use the same example that you've been talking about this afternoon. So the physical exercise case study for depression in adolescents. And I have listed there all the sections in a grant application that you should probably mention something about your qualitative study. So I just want to say that most of the things I will discuss are common sense, probably well known, and perhaps I'm repeating things that the other presenters have already said in the previous sessions, but applicants often forget or neglect to include them for various reasons. So that's why I think it's very important to look at them each one separately. So starting from the background, there you should include something about the importance of collecting qualitative data. Why do you need to have qualitative data? In our case study here, it's a feasibility study, so we're assuming we're collecting some qualitative data to complement the trial. You need to say if there are any other qualitative studies out there in a similar topic, what is the gap you're trying to fill in, and of course, clearly state your qualitative aims and objectives. And here is highlighted in red, like key terms that you should be using to help the reviewers understand you're planning a qualitative study. So here, for example, using the case study, we said the aim is to explore acceptability of the intervention and by gathering patients and clinicians' perspectives to inform the future trial. And the objectives, of course, are conducting interviews to explore acceptability, views, and patient adherence. So following on from your aims and objectives is the research plan section. In terms of the research design, the reviewers obviously want to see your study design, and you need to state your approach clearly. They might be wondering if your chosen design has been informed by the research question, your aims or objectives, perhaps some main theories in this area. And also it would be important to say how the qualitative study fits in with the other work packages in the application. So the wording could be something like this. where you state clearly the designs and nested qualitative study, and you say which methods you're going to use. Moving on to the study population and recruitment, the reviewers here, they want to know who you will include in your interviews. So you need to consider and provide an answer to all these bullet points here. Who is your study population? What are the eligibility criteria? Have you thought about inclusion exclusion criteria? How will the participants be recruited? What will be the process? So here's an example of how you might write your study population and how you can explain how these adolescents will be approached and the process of taking part in the study. The one thing I want to say is that we do understand the word count is always an issue, but you can see there are ways that you can write these very important key terms succinctly, as you can see in the example here. And of course, don't forget that RSS, we're very used to reviewing grant applications, and we can help with that. So moving on to sampling strategy. Sampling, as you probably know, is very important in qualitative research, and so are the EDI considerations. So the next step is to explain the type of participants you're looking for and your sampling strategy. Here are some examples of sampling strategies. I guess the most important thing is that you need to explain and justify. Perhaps you want to use a convenient sampling, which is less robust, but sometimes you need to use it. For example, if you're trying to recruit hard-to-reach groups, for example, homeless people or people with a rare disease. Or you might want to use a snowball sampling, which is when existing participants recruit others that they know they will be eligible for your study. And here is an example of how you would write this section to explain your sampling strategy and to show that you have considered the characteristics of the sample you're interested in including in your study. I know you're going to have a session on the importance of research inclusion tomorrow, so I'm not going to say anything about that. But I'm sure you know that EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion is very important for NIHR. It's a condition for funding, so make sure you are addressing the EDI aspect in your qualitative section as well. So sampling size, there are, oops, no, it's moved too quickly, sorry. There are many ongoing discussions and debates, if you like, in the qualitative research community of how many interviews, how many participants are enough. Obviously, in qualitative studies, large numbers are not needed. The emphasis is on the richness, the depth of the data and the analysis. So we're not aiming for statistical significance or generalizing the results. So small samples are appropriate. So the decision of how many you will include, well, it depends on many factors. Some of them presented here in blue. It could be based on your research question, the type of population. For example, if you're recruiting people with a rare disease, probably you're not going to have a large sample. But also on the approach that you're following. Are you recruiting until saturation is reached, or perhaps you're guided by information power? And again, other factors are the time and the budget available to carry out and collect your qualitative data. As a rule of thumb, we say 20 to 30 participants for individual interviews and 3 to 5 focus groups. But again, that all depends on all the factors we presented there. I guess the most important thing, the key message, is to justify why you're presenting this sample size and add the reference, as you can see in the example there. In the data collection section, you need to describe how you will collect the data, where and when. And of course, if you have the space, you could add more details. You might want to include some examples of the questions you will be asking the participants. or perhaps some details about your interview schedule, how it was developed, the location or the duration of the interviews. And here is an example of how you might want to write this section to make sure you cover all the bullet points above. Data analysis. So here the reviewers would like to see how you will go about analyzing your data, what analytical approach you will use and why. Is your analysis following a specific approach? Is it perhaps informed by a theoretical framework? These are all important information that you should try to include in your qualitative section. There are many types of qualitative analysis. Here are some in blue. Every approach has its own purpose and processes. Some are more inductive, others are more deductive. It's always an element of interpretation and subjectivity. So it's a good practice to tell the reviewers the key steps you will be taking in undertaking your analysis. And of course, to tell them if you use any tools, for example, software that can help you with the data management or perhaps AI. Again, my key message here is justify another reference. There are many papers out there on how to do qualitative analysis. And here's the example of how you might want to write that section on your qualitative analysis. Again, providing a reference and details on the tool you will be using. Also, it will be good to mention how you will ensure that your qualitative study will be robust to avoid any potential biases in your data in your analysis. So there are different strategies, as you can see there, standard methods that we use. Perhaps you want to complete an audit trail that is to make sure you record all your decisions of how you recruited your patients, how you analyze your interviews and all that, or perhaps you want to add another person, another coder that can help you coding the data. Quality checklists are also helpful, and I think that's the next slide, isn't it? Yeah, so here are some links and some references if you wish to look for these. Ethical issues. Ethical issues, consent, anonymity, confidentiality, data sharing, data storage, all of that are very important to include if possible. And I know, again, we said there's a limited space and you might not have the space to explain all that, but it's so important to show to the reviewers that you have considered such issues. And of course, if your project is dealing with perhaps vulnerable populations, people at the end of life and stuff, it would be good to add a couple of sentences there to show that exactly that you have considered all these ethical aspects and you are doing your best to secure anonymity and data storage issues. Now, I wanted to briefly talk about the knowledge mobilization, dissemination, and impact. And just to say that you need to be realistic, really, and specific with what you expect to achieve at the end of your qualitative study. For example, in this case study, with the feasibility study, the case study we are using, um, the dissemination might be the end point. But if it was a main trial, then probably you need to explain more about the uptake and use, the influence that your findings might have on clinical guidelines. So in that case, dissemination needs to be more widespread to ensure that the findings reach the end users, commissioners of the health and social care. And here's an example to say how you hope to disseminate your findings. Another thing that the reviewers will scrutinize is your timeline, and you will most probably have to upload a Gantt chart to show that you have allocated appropriate time for conducting and analyzing your qualitative study. Always try to show clearly on the Gantt chart the data collection, the data analysis period, the recruitment period, and all that important information. And perhaps think if you're and decide if your data analysis will be done at the end of the data collection period or it will go alongside your data collection. People often underestimate the time it takes to conduct and analyze qualitative studies. Also now people perhaps are more keen to use AI that can assist with the processes. I guess if you are doing that, you have to declare it, and of course that should be reflected again on your Gantt chart. Now, moving on to the other parts of the application. So far we're talking about the research plan. Now, there is a section on the team, the research team. So another aspect that they will look at is whether you have qualitative expertise in your team, and you need to cost them in properly. And you also need to explain why this particular co-applicant is well placed to lead this qualitative work, if they have track record of leading qualitative research, things like that. And in addition, you might want to consider another qualitative applicant or employ someone else as a research assistant to help with the recruitment and analysis of the data. So the text might look like something like this, where you explain that the qualitative lead is experienced and they can lead the specific work stream in the feasibility study. Now, you probably have seen this before, I think, in your study session. So it's a useful resource because it gives you, it helps you to consider the potential input and the role of the qualitative expert as part of your team. So from the study development all the way to the study close. And ideally, they should be integrated in the team throughout the length of the study, not just for the qualitative component. Costs. So when you're costing your qualitative study, there are some important aspects that you need to consider, not just staff costs, but also equipment, software, transcription fees, and all that. These will all vary. Obviously, each study is different depending on the research question and the methodology, but this is a kind of a starting point for the discussions you might want to have with your qualitative co-applicants on what are the things that you should be costing into your grant. I only have a couple more slides to present to you. So on this slide, I just want not to forget to include the qualitative study elements in the other sections of the grant application. For example, here, the plain English summary and the scientific abstracts. And of course, in the plain English summary, you want to avoid using technical research terms, but you should be using all these keywords highlighted here in red in the scientific abstract. And this is my last slide. When summarizing everything that I've been talking about on how to draft a fantastic qualitative grant application. And the reviewers would love to your application if the rationale is well justified, if your methods, data collection, analysis are clearly described and aligned with your research question, if your timeline, your impact, your costs are realistic, if you have considered the ethical and make sure you have a rigorous qualitative design, if you have separated your PPI from your qualitative research.